Hello, my name is Andrew Keen. Welcome to Keen on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. At the beginning of the 21st century, there were a group of atheists associated with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, who all argued that smart people shouldn't take God seriously, that if you were rational, you couldn't be religious. If you believed in science, then you wouldn't believe in God. But it seems as if things are changing. A few months ago, we had Charles Murray on the show, the author, the controversial author of the book, The Bell Curve, who had a new book out entitled Taking Religion Seriously. And even atheists are taking religion seriously these days. My old friend John Rausch from the Brookings Institute has a new book out called Cross Purposes, suggesting that religion is the moral and political backbone of democracy. Today, we're talking about reason and American history and religion with my guest, Daniel Williams. He has a new book out, The Search for a Rational Faith, Reason and Belief in the History of American Christianity. And I wonder, Daniel, whether this debate between reason and Christianity and this attempt to fuse the two has been one of the core features of American intellectual history. Is that fair? And that the supposed four horsemen of the apocalypse, the Dennetts and Hitchens of the world, simply have misunderstood American history?
Yeah, I think so. I think for most of American history, a lot of intellectuals, people educated at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, in fact, the people who ran those institutions for centuries actually saw reason and Christianity as being very compatible. They believed that their reason supported their Christian faith. And for several decades in the 19th century, all of the leading colleges in America offered classes on how to harmonize faith and reason. And even in the 20th century, after those classes disappeared at some of America's elite institutions, there was still a Christian veneer, and a number of public intellectuals, including professors, college administrators, who continued to see faith and reason as very compatible.
Can one, though, Daniel, can one combine reason and faith? Isn't religion itself, isn't that the history of religion as being beyond, the history of religion being beyond reason? It doesn't make it necessarily irrational, but it doesn't make it rational either.
Well, that's not the way that most Americans of the 18th and 19th centuries saw this. I think that's a view that became very common at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And it's certainly a view that a lot of people take for granted today, though certainly a lot of people don't. A lot of people view reason and Christianity as compatible. But the way that a lot of people in the early 19th century and the 18th century as well would have seen it is that Christianity is the story, or purports to be the story, of something that happened historically. That is, it's in some way related to Jesus, a historical figure, and that one can use the process of historical examination to find out something about the historical Jesus. They would also say that Christianity, along with Judaism for that matter, is based on the idea of a creator of the universe, and that therefore one can use scientific investigation to find out something about the order of the universe and therefore find out something about the creator. And those two ideas, the idea that natural theology, which is about the scientific investigation of the natural world in order to find God, and historical investigation leading to an evidentiary-based Christian faith, those two ideas were believed by many of the leading lights of the late 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So beginning with John Locke and Isaac Newton in England, both of whom did their own Christian apologetics of sorts, even though they were very liberal Christians for their time. And continuing on with William Paley in the late 18th century, and then with classes on Christian evidences at all of America's leading institutions in the early to mid 19th century. Several generations of educated people in both England and America came away from their college education with the idea that faith and reason could be harmonized, because both told, while not exactly the same story, told parallel stories that had a common root in the observable world.
We don't have Christopher Hitchens around these days, unfortunately, Daniel. So maybe I'll try and be him for a bit. It's all very well talking. I wonder if Hitchens would take this line. It's all very well talking about Newton and Locke, and you're right. They certainly were apologists for a certain rational Christianity. But of course, they were writing before Charles Darwin and his understanding of history, of the history of our species, and of course before the history of other scientists who reinterpreted the history of the earth and proved that the Bible was fundamentally wrong. How would you respond to that? That going back to Newton and Locke doesn't really tell us very much, because they hadn't read Darwin. They hadn't read many of the other authors, intellectuals who proved that the Bible was mostly wrong, fictitious.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly true that they lived at a time of a different conception of the universe. The Newtonian universe was certainly different than Darwin's universe, and that Darwin's universe in turn has been reshaped in the 20th century by other newer scientific ideas that have built on Darwin. I think that historically it matters, though, what Locke and Newton thought, because the argument that the Enlightenment and Christian faith were fundamentally opposed to each other, I think, breaks down when we find out that some of the leading advocates of the English Enlightenment, like John Locke, also wrote works of Christian apologetics, as Locke did. But beyond that, I would say the history of reason and Christian faith continues after Darwin, and this is where I found perhaps some of the most interesting insights in my research. After Darwin, even in Northeastern colleges that pretty much universally accepted evolution, the classes in Christian evidences did not disappear. So at Oberlin College, for example, George Frederick Wright, an evolutionist and a geologist, a professional geologist, was appointed as professor of the harmony of science and religion in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, and he continued in that post until around 1906. But he was appointed to that post after Oberlin College had accepted Darwinian evolution, and Wright himself, was a strong believer in the evolutionary process. But he also believed that there was a way to harmonize science and faith. And so in the late 19th and early 20th century, people who accepted Darwin's view of the world, at least his scientific views, obviously Darwin himself reached a crisis of faith and became an agnostic. And so the people who were trying to harmonize science and faith didn't accept everything that Darwin said about religion. But if we take the scientific theory itself, people who accepted that and who also held on to a Christian faith tended to harmonize that with Christianity in at least two different ways. So there were some conservatives, theological conservatives, that is, not political conservatives, but theological conservatives like Wright, who believed that, yes, Darwin was right about the origins of the world, and that Genesis 1 and 2 could be reinterpreted to fit Darwinian evolution into that model, but that the rest of the Bible could essentially be held pretty much intact. There were theological liberals, on the other hand, who said that no, not just Darwin's theory, but historical criticism of the Bible, which was coming from German universities at that time, had really reshaped the way that people understood not only the Bible, but even history itself, that they began to believe that history was evolutionary in a sense. It was progressive, and that what people believed 2,000 or 3,000 years ago might be very different and should be very different from what people believe today, that we have moved beyond mythological thinking. And yet, so many of those people accepted some form of Christian faith as necessary. And that continued actually in America's leading intellectual centers right through the early years of the Cold War. And the reason for that is that people believed that faith and science were telling two different stories. That yes, maybe at an observable level, one could not arrive at the sort of historical proof claims for Christianity that had meant so much to people in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. But it was still just as important as ever to arrive at a fixed understanding of morality that religion provided. And so Christianity, or religion in general, not just Christianity, but religion and science, existed in separate spheres. And that separate spheres model that said that both were necessary, but were essentially about different things, that you could not get to morality through science, and you could not get to scientific truth through religion. That model guided a lot of American thinking right through the 1960s.
Daniel, what's the point of the book? You're a historian. You've written extensively on Christianity. You wrote a book, for example, about abortion in America's churches. The title of the book is not The Discovery of a Rational Faith, it's The Search. Should we be surprised by that? Isn't it reasonable to assume that we as humans, we want to understand the origins of the universe? We eagerly embrace the promise of some eternal purpose, but at the same time, we recognize that reason, science certainly can't prove that. So should we be surprised that American intellectuals, from the founding fathers through John Adams, through many other figures, right up until today, people like Ross Douthat, they're all searching for a rational faith, but it's one thing to search for one, it's quite another to find one.
Yeah, in some ways, I don't think we should be surprised. And certainly if we take the view that many Christians have held, that people have a spiritual dimension, unless for some reason it's suppressed, we shouldn't be surprised that religion continues to reappear long after the Enlightenment, Darwin, other challenges to people's beliefs, that people are also, of course, rational creatures. And so the idea that people would try to combine rationality and faith should, in my view, not surprise us at all. However, it does surprise many people because there's a very popular idea that has been present for decades called the secularization hypothesis. And that is the idea that that's the theory that as societies become more industrialized, as people become more educated, as we become more scientific, that people will naturally leave religion behind. And in support of this, many people will point to Western Europe, which is really Exhibit A for defenders of this theory. And they would say that if you look at Western and Northern Europe, you can find in almost every country a decline of church attendance, a decline of religious adherence over the past half century and more, and that as you've had rising levels of popular education, people simply find religion less credible. But I think that whatever promise that theory holds in explaining particular stories in some countries, it doesn't seem to be true universally. And the United States has, for a long time, been an interesting exception to that. In the last 15 years, of course, people have commented a lot on rising rates of religious non-adherence and even slightly rising rates of atheism. in the United States. But for most of modern American history, the United States has been an outlier among Western nations. It has not only had fairly high levels of college education, but also very high levels of religiosity by almost every measure. Belief in God, religious identity and adherence, and church attendance have all been significantly higher in the United States. And so I wanted to tell the story of why that might be. And now, one possible answer could be that people simply compartmentalize their lives, and that what they do during the week doesn't necessarily affect what they do on Sunday morning, and vice versa. But I'm not sure that's true. I think that actually people do integrate their thinking, and that as people embrace a scientific worldview and simultaneously hold on to some sort of religious faith, particularly Christian faith in the United States, that they find ways to harmonize those. And so I thought that a study of some of the most highly educated people in the United States, people who helped to run and teach at America's leading Northeastern colleges, a study of the thinking in those places over the last few hundred years could show how people dealt with this tension as well as harmony between reason and Christian faith.
Yeah, and your book covers a lot of these elites, everyone from Harriet Beecher Stowe to John Adams to Martin Luther King. We got a show coming up on Jefferson. Jefferson's an interesting character in terms of this narrative. How does he fit in to the search for a rational faith?
Well, Jefferson did have a rational faith. It was not an Orthodox Christian faith by any means. It was much more of a deistic faith, if we understand deism to be a belief in a creator that's stripped of the miraculous. And yet Jefferson had a very high respect for Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus' moral teachings. He also believed that this creator God that he thought had created the universe had not simply walked away, was not simply the absent clockmaker God, as some people picture deists of the 18th century as believing, but was someone who continued to guide the universe through some sort of providence and held out a promise of both rewards and punishments in the afterlife. Jefferson was certainly a lot more liberal theologically than many Americans were of his generation, but he was also very much engaged in this skeptical examination of evidences for Christianity, accepting those evidences from natural theology that he thought provided clear evidence of the existence of a creator and of even some of the attributes of that creator, but also rejecting the claims of the miraculous. And there were Christians of his time who wrote to him, encouraging him to read other works of Christian evidences, saying if he only read the right works of Christian apologetics, that he would become a believer. It seems that Jefferson actually did read fairly widely in the discipline of Christian apologetics. But like Benjamin Franklin, one of his contemporaries, of course, older contemporaries, he accepted a version of liberal Christianity that was, in his view, more compatible with reason than those who thought that the evidence showed the truth of the Christian Gospels.
Daniel, in your book, do you suggest that there is an intimacy between what you call rational faith and morality? Jefferson, of course, is a very controversial man, not just one of the fathers of the Republic and of freedom and self-realization and all the rest of it, but also as a slaveholder. And many people don't really quite understand how he could simultaneously hold two versions of the world. Your book also covers Martin Luther King as an example, again, of somebody who searched for a rational faith. Are those people who at least search for the rational faith, everybody from Jefferson and Adams upwards, In your analysis, are they better people? Are they more moral people? Or are they capable of the kind of gross moral hypocrisy that many believe Jefferson was guilty of?
They're certainly capable of gross moral hypocrisy. So, I think empirically it's very difficult to support the idea that Christians of whatever sort, whether rational or not, have a superior moral behavior to the rest of the world. Certainly, one can find saints among Christians, but one can find great sinners as well. And I think that the view that many Americans had of up until the 1960s, and this view did begin to break down in the 1960s, but up until the 1960s, that there was this close relationship between religion and morality. Those people did not necessarily claim that all Christians were morally superior to non-believers on an individual level. In fact, had they made that claim, one could find numerous examples of people who would call that into question. So, for example, one of the most famous skeptics of the 19th century, late 19th century in America was Robert Ingersoll, who by all accounts was a pretty upstanding moral individual, someone who was strongly opposed to slavery, and that had led him to support the Republican Party, someone who continued to advocate for the rights of the less fortunate, someone who was not engaged in moral scandals. And one could also find prominent Christians of his time, liberal Christians like Henry Ward Beecher, more conservative Christians as well, who were living duplicitously, engaged in various extramarital affairs or engaged in other forms of blatant hypocrisy. So, and similarly, in terms of slavery, many, if not most, of the most prominent defenders of slavery in the South were Christians. So, just as religion was important to some of those who advocated against slavery, and very central, of course, to the claims of many African American abolitionists, so religion was also instrumental in supporting slavery. So that's not necessarily the claim that Christians are morally superior to people, or that people who are religious tend to be better people than those who are not religious. But the claim that I think was widely accepted, even among very educated people in the 1950s, was that without religion as a moral constraint, that any sort of moral anarchy would be theoretically possible. That in the world of the atomic bomb, as people said in the 1950s, that there had to be some form of restraint and some form of transcendent thinking. Similarly, in the case of Martin Luther King, who, of course, was in some ways a great moral leader, also, as we know from an examination of his private life, capable of some moral hypocrisy himself. But in his view, it was not possible to engage in the practice of nonviolent resistance to evil, nonviolent civil disobedience over the long term without some belief that the universe bent toward justice, that there was a moral force in the universe. For him, it was God. He acknowledged that for some people, it might not be God, but there had to be something beyond mere materialism in the universe to motivate people to take that sort of courageous stance. And so I think there was, in the 1950s and early 1960s, a fear among a lot of Americans that if the United States became as officially atheistic as the Soviet Union or China, that society would lose its moral grounding, that the sort of moral constraints that held the world together would no longer operate. So, sure, individuals could be moral hypocrites, but even the act of hypocrisy was an acknowledgement of a moral standard. And if those moral standards went out the window altogether, as people suspected they would if there was no religious framework to hold them in place. Many people found that to be a frightening idea.
Your book, of course, begins with the history of American Puritanism. The most famous book, I think, on the Puritans is Max Weber's thesis about capitalism and Puritans and the need for Puritans to somehow morally cleanse themselves by working hard and making money. What does your book tell us, this search for a rational faith? What does it tell us about the intimacy between, shall we say, the fathers, and they tended to be male, of American Christianity and of American capitalism? Were they often the same individuals, and was it the same kind of search for reason? I mean, Weber thought that, and in this sense, I guess, is much more in the Nietzschean camp, that because we can't prove anything, we clutch at straws, and the most attractive straw perhaps was capitalism.
Well, it is true that the United States had a capitalist ethic from its early days. I think that those who were searching for a rational faith were not invariably defenders of the free market in sort of a Reagan New Right sense. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many of the liberal Protestants who continued to defend the rationality of Christianity were also advocates of the social gospel. And some of the advocates of the social gospel were veering toward a Christian socialism. Others might not have gone quite as far as Christian socialism, but nevertheless were progressives who believed in state intervention in the free market. So one of the people I mentioned early on, just in passing, was this Oberlin professor, George Frederick Wright. And Wright certainly believed in various interventions, government interventions in the market. Now, nevertheless, that aside, it is true that the United States has been overwhelmingly capitalistic, just as it has been overwhelmingly Christian. I think that a lot of the defenders of a rational faith were living in an era when that dependence on capitalism was barely debated, and so they didn't necessarily write on that. They tended to take for granted that some form of free market would operate, and so maybe they would write on how to address care for the poor or something of that nature, but they were not questioning the fundamental tenets of the capitalist system in the United States. I think America's commitment to capitalism is larger than the Puritans, because if we look at what happened in the South among the Anglicans who came to Virginia, for example, we can find the market forces operating in another form. So Virginia's success as a colony depended on its cash crop of tobacco, in the same way that South Carolina, a slave society, was founded on its market exports, its indigo and rice and later tobacco, and eventually cotton. So that dependence on the market was definitely part of the American story. I'm not sure it required belief in God to make it work, but I do think that certainly the forms of Christianity that tended to be most popular in the United States were forms of Christianity that were very compatible with that market ideal. And that was especially true in the early to mid 19th century, at a time when a lot of the classes in Christian evidences were most pervasive at American colleges and universities. It was that moment that we really saw a burgeoning market economy and a society that was adjusting to become structured around that growth of industry. And so a lot of Americans did see religion and capitalism as going hand in hand. Later, though, America was such a Christian country that most of those who pushed back against that capitalist ideal in the early 20th century did so from a Christian framework. So even America's leading socialist, Eugene V. Debs, who himself was not a Christian believer, oftentimes appealed to the morality of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus in critiquing those forces of capitalism that he equated with the money changers that Jesus cast out of the temple.
Yeah, I'm guessing Eugene Debs would be more popular now at Oberlin than certainly most 19th century Christian thinkers. You yourself teach just as Oberlin is in Ohio, I think, you teach at Ashland University in Ashland, Ohio. What's your game here, Daniel? You've written a series of books on religion. You're a scholar of religion. In this book, are you trying to justify? I'm guessing that you yourself personally have an interest in this search for rational faith. Have you searched for it? Have you found it? How does this personally affect you?
Yeah, I have searched for it. Certainly, I'll say in this book, I write as a historian. So there are some books where I have said a little bit more about where I'm coming from. Perhaps the one where I've given away more of my own personal beliefs is The Politics of the Cross, which was written for a Christian audience. And in that book, I talk extensively about where I'm coming from. This is a book that is published by Oxford University Press, and it's designed to reach a wide audience of believers in Christianity, people who are not believers in Christianity, people who are unsure, but people who are interested in the historical story. And so I think regardless of people's own personal beliefs, there's something that you'll be able to get out of this book. And if you read this book, you won't find anything directly about my own personal spiritual journey in this. But I think it's a great question that you ask, because I do think that every book that people write in some way relates to their own interest, even if they don't necessarily state what that is. And so, yes, I would say that I grew up in a conservative Christian home where I acquired a view that Christianity should be compatible with what I saw in the observable world. And there were times in my life where I went through prolonged moments of doubt in that. And certainly reading Christian apologetics was something that was of great interest to me. I found some answers there, and then other times I felt like the works that I was reading weren't necessarily offering persuasive arguments. But I think because I've had that view as an educated person, obviously, as someone who has traveled in circles that are not exclusively Christian, going to a secular university, Case Western Reserve University, for my undergraduate experiences, and then for my PhD at Brown University, I was forced to confront questions about whether I could rationally believe in the Christian doctrines that I had acquired over the years, starting with my upbringing. And that quest, I think, did lead me to both become firmer in some of my convictions and also to change some of my beliefs. So I do write as a Christian. Now, I don't directly state that in the book, but because I'm a Christian and because I believe in the rationality of Christian belief at some level, I therefore am very interested in the questions of how people wrestled with challenges to their faith. And I would say that the type of rational faith that people arrived at, that my subjects arrived at in this book, is not uniform. So the beliefs of John Locke, for example, were not necessarily the beliefs of Reinhold Niebuhr, nor were they the beliefs of Martin Luther King. And so I think in each generation, the way that people are wrestling with these questions is determined to a certain extent by their larger historical context. And I find that subject to be really interesting. So I guess I would say that this book is not a book of Christian apologetics. There are, of course, numerous books of Christian apologetics, many of which I reference in this book. But this book is not designed primarily to persuade people that Christianity is rational, or the Christian belief is rational. It's rather a study of how the people who thought that it could be rational arrived at those conclusions, confronted different challenges to their faith, and arrived at answers that in some cases may be persuasive to some readers, in other cases probably would not be.
I know you, it's interesting you mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the most influential of American theologians. He had a big influence on an old friend of mine and of the show, Peter Wehner. I'm sure you're familiar with Wehner. He writes extensively for the New York Times and the Atlantic in particular. He's become a critic on what he calls the ethical darkness that has fallen upon contemporary America. He's very, very critical of the evangelical movement. I'm not sure he would use the word irrational when it comes to the evangelicals, but there certainly seems to be an element of irrationality in their take on America and the world, and indeed on morality itself. What does your book, Daniel, tell us about this cleavage, it would seem, between the old school Christians seeking this rational faith, everybody from Newton and Locke to Martin Luther King and Reinhold Niebuhr, and the evangelical movement now, who are strongly MAGA? Are there lessons in the book? I don't want to turn this into just another boring conversation about Trump, but I'm guessing there are implications in what you've discovered for American Christianity in an age where many American Christians see Trump as some sort of savior figure.
Yeah, I do think the book has some implications on that, even though it has some implications for that, even though Trump's name is never mentioned in this book. I tried very hard in the book.
Congratulations on that,
thanks.
Daniel.
Yeah, I tried very hard in this book to not make this simply another analysis of politics that would become dated. I certainly have written widely, as you know, on the Christian right, on American politics and religion and politics.
And abortion in particular. You've written a couple of books on that.
But I think in this book, what I discovered that I think is relevant for this question is that the vast majority of this book focuses on what today we would call mainline Protestantism or liberal Protestantism. But I think that would come as a surprise to a lot of evangelicals. I found among evangelicals quite a bit of interest in this book. And when I describe it as a history of Christian apologetics in America, they immediately start naming names of different fairly recent evangelical apologists and ask if I cover those. Do I cover certain figures of the late 20th century that were influential among evangelicals in harmonizing faith and reason, or providing intellectual defenses of the faith. And I do a little bit in the final chapters of the book, but about 70 or 80% of the book, I would say, focuses on mainline Protestants, because mainline Protestants were the ones that not only built America's leading educational institutions for the most part, but they were also the ones that were the leading practitioners of Christian apologetics for a very long time, the idea of harmonizing faith and reason. Now, in the book, I explain why liberal Protestants dropped that project at the end of the 1960s. And that also coincided, I think, with a crisis of faith that a lot of younger liberal Protestants had. And ever since the late 1960s, liberal Protestants have had a harder time retaining their younger members than other Christian traditions, particularly conservative evangelicals, have. And as a result, today, mainline Protestantism is only a fraction of the size that it was 50, 60, or 70 years ago. Now, as that has happened, I think that the brand of American Christianity has shifted to the right, because without mainline Protestants there to balance it, when people think of Christian in the United States today, when they think of Protestant Christianity, the first image that comes to mind is conservative evangelicalism, Christian nationalism, Trump voters. Those are not things that would have immediately come to mind to many observers of American Christianity in the 1950s. Instead, if you looked at the cover of Time magazine during that era, sure, you would see Billy Graham every so often, but you would also see Reinhold Niebuhr. You would see other leading theologians and practitioners of mainline Protestant Christianity. So as we have shifted toward the most conservative forms of evangelicalism as the leaders in American Christianity, we've also in some ways seen not necessarily the end of a search for rational faith, but a search for a faith that's disconnected from the institutions of reason that Americans have. And so among a lot of conservative evangelicals, it's not that they believe in irrationality. It's rather that they have embraced a different form of reasoning that is divorced in many ways from mainline Protestantism and from the secularized institutions that mainline Protestants have created. And that's why I think in the last few years, it's become obvious that Americans don't necessarily have a common language of basic reason anymore, that we disagree with each other on the most basic of facts. And that, I think, is a scary prospect, not only for American religion, but for American democracy, as you probably well know.
Yeah, and finally, as Charles Murray said when he came on the show, religion is all the rage now. It's very fashionable. Everyone from Ross Douthat's Believe, who seems to take your argument that if you're rational, you should be religious, to odder characters like Peter Thiel, who gave a series of popular lectures a few months ago on the Antichrist. Finally, Daniel, what would you like to see? You're clearly not an evangelical yourself. Do you want to go back to the 50s or the 1840s? Is there a future for your rational faith that can get beyond odd characters like Thiel, who seem to have troubling political agendas of their own?
Well, I think what I would like is not likely to happen.
Well, I don't mind. We can still hear it.
Yeah. I believe in the tradition of moderate liberalism in the United States, and yet I also believe that it has to have a higher grounding in order to work. I think the challenge for centrists, political centrists in the U.S., is to come up with a way to both appeal to the transcendent, people's sense of the transcendent, and appeal to people's sense of rationality, and to pursue policies that are based on empirical reason, but are not devoid of that larger story. And whether or not that can work in our polarized society is an open question. But I think that for those people who are perhaps more skeptical of religion, I hope that my book will show that a rational faith, or a search for rational faith, has had a long trajectory in the United States, and that religion has not been simply an anti-liberal reactionary force, but actually has been central to the American story and to the American Human Rights Project. To people on the right who are strongly religious and also deeply suspicious of America's institutions of higher education, I hope that this book will show that actually those institutions of higher education have much more of a faith history than what they might have imagined. So maybe in some small way, this book will contribute to a better understanding on all sides, though obviously this is a much larger problem than any single book can address.
Well, there you have it. The Search for a Rational Faith, Reason and Belief in the History of American Christianity. Interesting thesis, interesting history. Daniel Kay Williams, congratulations on the book, and best of luck in your own personal search for a rational faith. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.